Welcome back to the second session today with Bartholomew Ryan and Hilda Tello. To begin with, we've got Bartholomew on philosophy as a way of life in 19th century existential philosophy. Bartholomew is a philosopher, musician, and researcher at Nova Universidade de Lisboa. He coordinates the research group Forms of Life and Practices of Philosophy. He's published various books and essays in penetrating philosophy and literature, most recently Fernando Pessoa and Philosophy, Captain Science and Habitats. Bartholomew is taught at universities in Brazil, Berlin, Oxford, Athens, Dublin, Lisbon, and Bishkek, and is currently writing a book called James Joyce, The Unfolding Art of Flourishing and Decay. And in music, he released a solo album in 2022, and leads international band The Living Heroes, as well as being a member of the Experimental Audio Formation Headbooks. Thank you, Bartholomew. You're online.
Hi there, Simone. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just gathering. Thank you so much. There's time there. Would you be able to give me a 5-minute warning when I come if I'm running out of time? So after 25 minutes, I have 30 minutes. So thanks very much for this, Simone. Thanks for the introduction, and also especially to Marta, Helder, and Pedro for their extraordinary work and endeavors. They must be exhausted already, and you're not even halfway through this day. So my thoughts are with you. So I'll get to it quickly. I'm going to show a PowerPoint as well, and it's really just an outline of the chapter, of course, and I'll speak more freely. So I'm going to speak freely with showing you some of the navigations I'm doing. So let's see if I can share with you. Okay, can you see that image?
Yeah, we can.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm in charge of the chapter Philosophy as a Way of Life, 19th Century Existential Philosophy. And there you have a picture of an idealized paintings, no doubt, of the three, especially with Kierkegaard, all as young people. We normally see Schopenhauer as an old, grisly, cranky man with his 2 pieces of hair plucking out. There he is as a young, virile man with very pouting lips. So just they're the three I'm going to look at. I was asked specifically to kind of focus on these three for this chapter, Philosophy's Way of Life in 19th Century Existential Philosophy. And the layout of the chapter, and which I hope to just kind of give you an overview in this talk, is, as you can see there, it's going to be the introduction of the 19th century. And my first point then, professionalizing and revitalizing the task and activity of philosophy. And point 2 will be self-overcoming, becoming and non-becoming a self, and kind of putting them in brackets. You got the self-overcoming with Nietzsche, the becoming a self with Kierkegaard, and the non-becoming a self ultimately with Schopenhauer. And then the third section, will, passion, faith, critiques of rationality and the Enlightenment, and the final section, giving style to one's character. Now, it's important when we go into, of course, Hadot was, Pierre Hadot has a section, of course, in Philosophy of a Way of Life on the figure of Socrates, and brings together Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and also has some interesting things to say about Schopenhauer in that book as well. It's important to think back in the 19th century as a quick overview, and I would just say in literally very short kind of introduction, is that what's happening in philosophy, politics, economics, and society of the 19th century, which very much informs these three thinkers as well in forging a philosophy as a way of life. Hegel and Hegelianism being especially pertinent for people like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. And it's very famous, of course. Schopenhauer and Hegel were contemporaries, and Schopenhauer tried to put on his lectures at the same time as Hegel, when Hegel was probably the most famous and influential philosopher at that exact time. And of course, nobody practically went to Schopenhauer's lectures while everyone was piling into Hegel's, and this really infuriated Schopenhauer. So For Schopenhauer and for Kierkegaard, especially Schopenhauer, Hegel was enemy number one. When I say Hegelianism for Kierkegaard, it's mostly Hegelianism. He was pretty enthralled and influenced by Hegel and remained a kind of a great dialectical thinker, went going in different directions, a critique of Hegel. But his beef was really Hegelianism, the Danish Hegelianism that had taken over philosophy, theology, and even theater and drama. The two figures being P.L. Heiberg, who was kind of the director of the National Theatre in Copenhagen, and was also a very famous writer and poet. And then you had Martensen, who was a Hegelian bishop and professor of theology in the University of Copenhagen. So this idea of Hegelianism and the professionalization of philosophy and in the academy and the great university professors was something that would struck a chord with both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard to forge out their own philosophy. And then you have the question, of course, in this intro, what is an existential philosopher of the 19th century? Of course, there are many people that are bracketed under the idea of existentialism or existential philosophy, very few actually accepting or taking that mantle themselves. But we can kind of think of, as disparate as they are, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, especially with Schopenhauer still considering himself a metaphysical thinker, still pursuing objectivity per se, he still can be fit into the bracket of the existential philosopher as a way of life. And what really brings these three together is this idea of individual transformation. In the wake of Hegelianism, Hegelian philosophy, the professionalization of philosophy as they see it, all three of them are united in this front and how they see that the scholars, philosophy has become sedate, has become lukewarm, has become a safety zone when it should be the contrary. It should be on the margins. It should be dangerous. It should be critical. It should be a risk. All these things, and to transform the individual. And it's interesting, kind of parallel to that, you have the collective transformation response to Hegel, of course, in Marx and Engels, when they call for many of their critiques were quite similar to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but they go into the area of collective transformation to transform society. With these three thinkers, it's really much a focus on transforming the self. And what makes them also, you can kind of bracket them in as these kind of prototypes of existential philosophers of the 19th century as a way of life, as a prelude to what happens in the 20th century, is that what's extraordinary is that Kierkegaard himself meditates on marriage, a philosophical analysis of marriage, three essays, probably the philosopher of modernity who writes most on marriage, and also focusing on the lesser known or lesser wanted areas of philosophy, such as depression, anxiety, despair, the concept of boredom. But also even with Schopenhauer, he's one of the few philosophers that really spends a lot of time thinking about and exploring the philosophical implications of love, sexual attraction, and also, of course, three of them on suffering. What is suffering? The suffering individual with Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And of course, suffering and passion here, especially with Kierkegaard, lidenskab is the word in Danish. It's quasi-religious, but it's also for Kierkegaard a state of human existence, to suffer and to become passionate. All these kind of great moments in our own human existence are always going to be interconnected with the idea of suffering and passion, and also cowardice and courage, the courage to exist or the cowardice to exist. And these are very much related with both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche regarding to how to live as a human being and the cowardliness that comes from that, or the courage that comes from that. Most notably, of course, in Kierkegaard's analysis of despair in The Sickness Unto Death. Might even call these people the philosophers of the heart. The most recent biography of Kierkegaard was very much called that, the philosopher of the heart, brimming from the heart. And that would kind of lead to the third section of my four parts, is this idea in will, faith, and even amor fati. There's something driving these philosophers, which is left out of what they see as the kind of the state of the mill, the status quo of philosophy, what's happened to philosophy after Hegel. And you have to remember also the 19th century, the period they're writing in, after the initial euphoria of Napoleon and the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, 1815, you have this age of restoration leading to the emergence and growth of the bourgeoisie, 1848. Is everything okay? Oh, it's just a microphone. Okay. And after 1848, you have the rise of unification of Germany and the age of Bismarck, the expansion of the Prussian Empire, and the age of industrial revolution. And this is an age of great optimism regarding to national building in Germany. And yet, here is Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer saying the exact opposite. Kierkegaard calls it an age of disintegration, which is going to come about now up and into the next century. Nietzsche famously talks about the advent of nihilism, and Schopenhauer is the great philosopher of pessimism against the German idealist contemporaries of his day. So the death of philosophy and the philosopher, you see this in Schopenhauer a lot, and Hadot picks up on this, and so do in the great chapter by Uri and Sharp in their book on philosophy of the way of life. They pick up on this as well, and look at this idea of the professionalization of philosophy. And Schopenhauer says, in the world as will representations masterpiece, live for philosophy and those who live on philosophy. So this is what's happened. People like what he sees as the kind of academics or professors of philosophy are now living on or off philosophy. Living for philosophy are those that don't. Someone like Spinoza or Berkeley, these are living for philosophy. The case of Immanuel Kant for Schopenhauer, Kant manages to navigate between the two. He's living for philosophy and philosophy. As for university philosophy, it is as a rule mere juggling and humbug. This is the idea of kind of almost the masturbation of ideas coming out, which is, again, you see this also with Karl Marx, interestingly enough, in that other direction of collective transformation, in that attack on the increasing impotence of philosophy, or this kind of self-satisfaction of philosophy. And with Kierkegaard, in the opening sentence of his provocative, one of his most dynamic texts, Fear and Trembling, under, that should be a FT rather than FW, Fear and Trembling, under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, he writes, not only in the business world, but also in the world of ideas, our age stages in ein wirklicher Ausverkauf, a real sale. So you see this, he compares the bankruptcy of Copenhagen after the Napoleonic Wars with the bankruptcy of ideas. And even halfway through the book, he writes, with security in life, they live in their thoughts, as in the professors of philosophy. They have a permanent position and a secure future in a well-organized state. They have hundreds, yes, even thousands of years between them and the earthquakes of existence. And there you can see why the 20th century existentialists were drawn to a text like Fear and Trembling. You see already this real kind of emphatic interest for Kierkegaard into kind of revitalizing philosophy as a passionate endeavor, as a vocation, as something that's not safe. And of course, Nietzsche himself will talk about to think dangerously. And here you have in the Untimely Meditations, one of the early texts by Nietzsche, I profit from a philosopher only insofar as he can be an example. The philosopher must supply this example in his visible life and not merely in his books. That is, it must be presented in the way the philosophers of Greece taught, through their bearing, what they wore and ate, their morals, rather than by what they said, let alone by what they wrote. How completely this courageous visibility of the philosophical life is lacking in Germany. And later, all modern philosophizing is political and official, limited by governments, churches, academies, customs, and the cowardice of men to the appearance of scholarship. Its size, if only, our knows, there once was and does nothing else. Within a historical culture, philosophy possesses no rights if it wants to be more than a self-restrained knowing which leads to no action. Are there still human beings? One then asks oneself, or perhaps only thinking, writing, and speaking machines? It's very haunting passages here, because here we are in the 21st century, and they could have been written today at the same time, what's happening in the world and the various challenges we have working at universities and trying to be critical thinkers. So really, this is back in the 1870s, so 150 years later, where this has really come the whole way to that place. Now, new kinds of philosophy and philosophizing in these three thinkers, in existentialism as a way of life. You know, Hannah Arendt says in The Human Condition, the rebellion of the philosophers against philosophy, beginning with Kierkegaard and ending in existentialism. There is something punk or rebellious about the existential philosopher against the professionalization or the established order of philosophy, which is why, of course, teenagers will be automatically drifting towards these kind of existentialist thinkers. But there's something very serious in their endeavor as well, that's long-lasting and enduring. And it's philosophy, for example, Schopenhauer's philosophy is an invitation to radically transform our way of life, as Hadot writes. Schopenhauer himself says philosophy, like the overture to Don Juan, starts with a minor chord. So this minor uncertain chord rather than a major chord, it brings us in to this danger, this space of uncertainty. It's going to shake us up. And Johannes de Silentio in Fear and Trembling, he calls himself not a philosopher. He says the present author is by no means a philosopher. He is poetus et eleganter, in a poetic and refined way, a supplementary clerk. And the word he uses is extra scriber, an extra writer, something that lies outside the system. It's something that someone like Jacques Derrida would have loved. You can see this influence there in the later in deconstructionism, who neither writes the system nor gives promises of the system, who neither exhausts himself on the system nor binds himself to the system. He writes because to him it is a luxury that is all the more pleasant and apparent the fewer there are who buy and read what he writes. Of course, there's great irony with Søren Kierkegaard. His first before he actually begins his authorship, he writes the concept of anxiety, of irony. So there's always that ironic attack on the Hegelian philosophers that they went further, they go further. I will not go further. There's nowhere else to go. I'm just going to focus on the single individual. And the opening line of The Sickness Unto Death, years later under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, many may find the form of this exposition strange. It may seem to them too rigorous to be upbuilding and too upbuilding to be rigorously scholarly. As far as the latter is concerned, I have no opinion. So there you go. He's navigating. He's already starting, like Nietzsche as well, disrupting the manner and way you write academic philosophy. And it begins, of course, The Birth of Tragedy, the first book of Nietzsche, while he is a professor of philosophy, causes ricochets. It's not understood as a work that is seen as properly scholarly or rigorous. And this is where, and they go on from there to Human All Too Human, Daybreak, Beyond Good and Evil, etc., etc. Thus spoke Zarathustra, very non-academic titles, very poetic titles. And with Kierkegaard, you also have these extremely kind of almost poetic or psychological texts, The Sickness Unto Death, Either Or, A Fragment of Life, Fear and Trembling, Philosophical Fragments, Training in Christianity. So, and at the end of Fear and Trembling, he writes, as long as the generation is concerned only about its task, which is the highest, it cannot become weary, for the task is always adequate for a person's lifetime. So it's the end, the individual and the single individual becomes the category of Kierkegaard's philosophy. And Nietzsche, in an early writing in the 1870s, writes in his notebooks, the philosopher as cultural physician. The philosopher's product is his life, which occupies the most important position before his works. His life is his work of art. And there you have again another classic dictum which you find later in the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, that creating your life is like creating a work of art. And there it is already in Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, here we go. Waking up the reader. Interesting, all three of them use this word of waking up. You can almost, at the beginning of some kind of spiritual exercise. It's the very beginning of the world as will and representation. The motto that Schopenhauer uses is from Rousseau: quit thy childhood, my friend, and wake up. And so begins this waking up to life, to existence, and what really means to exist and how it is to be a human being. And in Kierkegaard's last, pseudonymous works by Anticlimacus, which he wrote 2 books, The Sickness Unto Death and Practicing Christianity. The subtitle of The Sickness Unto Death is a Christian psychological exposition for upbuilding and awakening. And the first section of the Practicing Christianity is for awakening and inward deepening. He responds a lot to this idea of awakening in the face of despair, in the face of death. And just as an example, in Works of Love, written under his own name, there's a sentence in the middle of the book: to the earnestness of death belongs the remarkable capacity for awakening. And the preface to Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche, he writes, we whose task is wakefulness itself. So this kind of awakening out of the bourgeois slumber and the professionalization of philosophy that has become there's this kind of a relationship, a very cozy relationship between church, state, citizens, and philosophy and university itself. So in the first of the 4, I have self-overcoming, becoming, and non-becoming. Sorry, this is the second of the 4, the first one being the professionalization and revitalization of philosophy. This is the second, where I'd like to try to show these 3 ways that these thinkers try to forge out their philosophy as a way of life. And with Kierkegaard, it's always this idea of becoming a self. And he has many strategies to doing this, which I'll mention one or two now in a moment. But well, I'll just say it now because I know I'll run out of time. But it's the idea of the Socratic method and of always deceiving oneself into the truth. You know, this myotic method that Kierkegaard used for his own Copenhagen environment, and of course, famously using over a dozen pseudonyms to do this. And it's always this for him, there's never any such thing as something that's static or staying or a system itself. The only system for Kierkegaard is death. I mean, the system, or God being a system. We are alive. When we are alive, there's nothing systematic going on. It's always changing, always in flux, and we always have the potential and the possibility to transform our situation, our inner situation. And he writes, everything is placed in the process of becoming, because the empirical object is not finished, and the existing knowing spirit is itself in the process of becoming. And that's in his largest philosophical work, with a ridiculous title called Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. And you can see the irony in that title already, and in what kind of book it was. It was meant to be a postscript sequel to his very slim volume, Philosophical Fragments, which is 100 pages long, and the Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments is over 600 pages long. So you can see that Kierkegaard, like Nietzsche, has lots of humor, which is another trick strategy of his writings, using humor, using irony, as he delves into the most difficult and darkest aspects of being human. And also, he writes later, in the point of view, a report to history, I regard myself as a reader of books, not as the author. So in the becoming, he is also almost working spiritual exercises on himself. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He learns about himself as he writes. And it's when he's constantly self-referencing himself and going back over himself, and even looking at this in the Concluding Unscientific Postscript, he has a section, a glance on Danish literature, which are more or less all his own books, which he looks and puts them against each other and tries to see what kind of ways of becoming a self they are doing. So it's a real exercise there, spiritual exercise that Kierkegaard is doing. And I'd like to also mention, even in the most extreme Christian author, who's Anti-Climacus, the title "Practicing Christianity," it's not a great title. Practice isn't in English, because it's actually "indulse" in Danish, which is a training. It can even be military exercises. It's really working out exercises, practicing, training, working through things to get to becoming a Christian. Because for him, Christianity is not a doctrine, but a process of becoming as well. And of course, you have these many examples in Nietzsche in how it begins, Antichrist, let us face ourselves, and how one becomes what one is in Ecce Homo. But of course, he's also trying to overcome the idea of subjectivity, get beyond myself and yourself. I'm just checking the time there, because I can't see anyone, by the way, except my slides right now. Okay, and with worlds of representation, you have these some of these extraordinary passages about going into oneself, and what you come out with is this an wavering, unstable phantom. And you can see the bottom quote there: as soon as we enter into ourselves fully by directing our knowledge inwards, we lose ourselves in a bottomless void. We find ourselves like a hollow glass globe, from the emptiness of which a voice speaks. But the cause of this voice is not to be found in the globe. And since we want to comprehend ourselves, we grasp with a shudder nothing but a wavering and unstable phantom. I'm just going to can you still see my slides? No.
No, we can't see.
Okay.
Now we've got it.
Okay. Okay, so I think I'll go back to the way I was. Sorry about this. I apologize, I have to be online. Damn it. Shouldn't have touched anything. It's not working. I can't move down. Okay, we're back. The figure of Socrates also central with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and how though in the philosophy as a way of life, these two great Socratics, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Well, of course, it's interesting because and Nietzsche has so many terrible things to say about Socrates and blames Socrates for so many things going wrong with Western civilization and Western culture. And yet he's put in this bracket of being a modern day Socratic as Kierkegaard is, because Socrates is existential, pertaining to the single individual, and is always looking at how to be a human being and thought and life activity. And for Kierkegaard, there's three aspects of Socrates: indirect communication, mask, and martyr. Some indirect communication, his myotic method, bringing out, deceiving oneself into the truth through the dialogue, which Kierkegaard is trying to do in his own writings. The mask, playing with the mask, feigning to be some kind of person that does not know anything, that kind of looks like a beggar, a vagabond on the street, and yet here he is, the wisest person in Athens. And the martyr, willing to die for the truth. And all these three aspects, actually, interestingly enough, pertain to Kierkegaard's Christ as well. For Kierkegaard, Christ is speaking in direct communication through parables, never giving direct answers, is the mask. Also, here is the Son of God, and who socializes with prostitutes and fishermen and outsiders, and is a martyr as well, who dies for the truth. And Kierkegaard, as Anticlimacus writes, popular opinion maintains that the world needs a republic, needs a new social order and a new religion, but no one considers that what the world, confused simply by too much knowledge, needs is a Socrates. And here we have this example of the individual transformation, not the collective one, not something calling for a new social republic, not for a whole new revolutionary new order or some kind of new evangelical religion, but rather looking back to the essence of the Greeks and modernizing into the modern day Greek Socrates, into someone like Kierkegaard, who calls himself the gadfly. And very revealing in the concluding on scientific postscript, Johannes Climacus writes, the most one person can do for another is to unsettle him. Interestingly enough, at the end of Kierkegaard's life in 1854, he did actually come across Schopenhauer, and it's quite revealing with Kierkegaard and with Schopenhauer. Of course, Schopenhauer died in 1860, Kierkegaard died in 1855 at the age of 42, and it was in his last year, very isolated, where he came across Schopenhauer. And it's very interesting what he has to write. He says, Schopenhauer has interested me a great deal, and I've been surprised to find an author who, despite a total disagreement, touches me so much. And of course, he probably would have been very much drawn to Schopenhauer, of course, because of his disdain and rude jokes about Hegel and Hegelianism and professors of philosophy and the professionalization of philosophy, but also the passion and fervor of Schopenhauer's writing and this willingness to kind of try to almost expose himself to all the various vicissitudes of existence. Whether he actually wanted to be funny in that way or not is another question, but Schopenhauer sees this and reads it with joy in the same way, that similar way that the young Nietzsche was inspired by the first readings of Schopenhauer. And Kierkegaard writes, if Schopenhauer had windbags to deal with, I have to cope with windsuckers. So this idea that windbags, the Hegelians blowing out the wind of Hegelian philosophy, and Kierkegaard has to take in the wind from the Hegelian. Yes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, thank you. And it also makes a funny note, AS, note, oddly enough, I am called SA because Kierkegaard's middle name was Abye. I am called, no doubt we ourselves, also inversely related. But he has this to say about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer does not himself represent the contemplation that is attained through asceticism. He is not a Greek philosopher living his philosophy. He is, after all, a German thinker bent on recognition. And that's really key there to show, when we think of philosophy as a way of life, Kierkegaard sees that Schopenhauer has failed to live philosophy as a way of life. He's not living his philosophies per se. He's neither embracing the passionate life nor becoming an ascetic either, and is still bitter and still obsessed with winning prizes until his dying day. And this is something that Kierkegaard is critical of in revealing his own wanting to be a philosopher as a way of life. I'm going to run out of time here, but I just wanted to say that that will, faith, and passion, critiques of rationality, enlightenment. What's quite inspiring especially for Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, is the early presence within the Enlightenment of Hamann and Herder, both of them who were very critical of the Enlightenment. The Magus of the North being Hamann and his famous little text, Socratic Memorabilia, in 1759, a good friend of Kant, but criticizing the problems of philosophy, which was very much inspirational to Kierkegaard. I remember Kierkegaard had much sympathy with lots of Enlightenment thinkers, especially Lessing. Lessing is a very important figure for Kierkegaard in forging his own philosophy of a way of life as a single individual. But here we brings in these. It's not that they're considered irrational, but that they want to show that actually the way we are governed by our thoughts is something that rational philosophy is overlooking, and that's of course will in the case of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and passion and faith in the case of Kierkegaard. And it's interesting that also Georg Lukács, at the bottom of that text, you'll see the MB there, his critique in the destruction of reason. The first three chapters are Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, that they are the founders of irrationalism and leading to the destruction of German philosophy. So it's very interesting, and I want to make a point of that in my chapter, which was only 8,000 words, by the way. So it's going to have to be quite fast. And the final point I'd like to make of the four is having your giving style, which sometimes overlooked. We see this with Nietzsche. It's famously been written about with Nietzsche, but it's also very much present explicitly in Kierkegaard. And you could almost say as well, I think what brought these, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, given the interest in Schopenhauer, was the fact that he had style as well. But what is it to have style? You have, well, let's let these people speak for themselves first. Johannes Climacus writes, one who is existing is continually in the process of becoming. The actually existing subjective thinker, thinking, continually reproduces this in his existence and invests all his thinking in becoming. This is similar to having style. Only one who really has style, who is never finished with something, but stirs the waters of language whenever he begins, so that to him the most ordinary expression comes into existence with newborn originality. And then Nietzsche in The Gay Science, one thing needful to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses that their nature has to offer, and then fit them into an artistic plan, while each appears as art and reason and even weaknesses delight the eye. And of course, the most obvious element of giving style, which with Kierkegaard, is the use of masks. And for both masks, for Nietzsche and for Kierkegaard, is essential. And Hadot picks up on this in The Philosophy of Way of Life. He writes, as for Kierkegaard, so for Nietzsche, masks were a pedagogical necessity, but also a psychological need. And I've run out of time, I realize that, but this idea of using the mask, again, it's part of the meiotic method, the Socratic method of Kierkegaard, deceiving one, giving you a multiplicity of ways of living, the ethical, the aesthetic, and the religious. And for Nietzsche also, only that he uses his own name, is this overcoming of oneself, this spiritual exercise of going through different texts and experimenting on himself. And that's very important, this idea of experimenting. It's almost, again, to some form of historicizing. Philosophy isn't experimenting on oneself. It's a becoming of oneself, not looking back on a history of oneself, but rather always transforming. And just as a final example, to show an example of this kind of element that breaks with the professional philosophy of the 19th century and what something like Kierkegaard tries to do, which of course for many departments he's not considered as a philosopher because he went too far. But here in the opening, the title page of Fear and Trembling, we have an example of a fusion of various disciplines all coming together to confuse the idea of the system or being appropriated into a system. You have the title Fear and Trembling, which is from the New Testament, the book of Philippians. So we have a kind of a religious title. You have a dialectical lyric. Here we have a paradox already in that it's poetic and it's philosophical at the same time. And it's by Johannes de Silentio, the mask, the theatrical element. And then you have a quote, the motto by Hamann, what Tarquinius Suburbius said in the garden by means of the poppies, the son understood, but the messenger did not. An example of indirect communication. Somehow, so I'll finish now with that. Just with that last two last little slide here, that these three thinkers of the 19th century as existentialist figures are a prelude or dress rehearsal for the 20th century. Alain Badiou once called the 20th century the century of the real. That the 19th century was a century brimming with ideas that were applied with devastating and destructive effect in the 20th century. And the different areas where these three thinkers have inspired 20th century various forms of individual transformation. In the negative sense, truth to subjectivity is a fetishization, and the various elements of phenomenology, existentialism, and post-structuralism that we'll hear a bit now with Helder, and inspiration in artists was massive, and it opened to marginalized people and groups, non-Western writers, and women philosophers, Simone Weil, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt, Iris Murdoch, etc. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a few questions. We've got a few minutes for questions. Does anyone want to kick off?
Thank you, Barry, for your wonderful presentation. Just to questions, just to if you can explain more about the maths in Kierkegaard, now how the maths, the very heteronymous Kierkegaard heteronymous could be related with philosophy and with life, with this becoming, that is embodied by Kierkegaard himself through his writing. And just a little question, why, I don't know if it's luck or intentional luck, not to speak, for instance, about French existentialism like Sartre or Camus.
I didn't catch the last part there.
Why did you not speak also about Sartre, for instance, or Camus, and if you foresee that in your chapter you could speak also about that?
Okay, well, the last part of your question is because I'm only focusing on the 19th century. I think someone else will be doing 20th century, and I think Helder will be talking about that. So my task is specifically 19th century.
You know why? Because you would an Arendt, for instance, that is, you know.
Well, I just wanted to show that, and actually, it was kind of from the last session as well about the lack of women philosophers and writers, which I'm very sensitive to as well. You have these three very male figures, and all three of them have made quite misogynist comments, as well as spending a lot of time thinking about women. So they're also even paradoxical there as well, because Kierkegaard is quite ambiguous, and even Nietzsche is in his, they weren't scared to really talk about these things. So I just wanted to mention that how not only we know the Camus and the Sartres and the Jaspers and the Heideggers, but there's a huge section, the first person in the English-speaking world to write about the existentialists 20th century was Iris Murdoch, in 1940s. It wasn't a man. And so that's just an important element, that they did inspire a movement of women philosophers as well. And I think that relates to their individual transformation. That's something, and also people like Frantz Fanon and other outside the European or Western kind of trajectory. As regarding your question on masks, yes, of course, I could have spent a long time talking about that. I mean, this idea that, Haddo talked about forms of life and creative mistakes and spiritual exercises. Kierkegaard's whole enterprise, as he calls it, is authorship, which begins with either or, is which he says is his first official book, either or. And of course, the subtitle is A Fragment of Life. And that's very much a book of literally spiritual exercises. And it's not really even either or. It's probably a three-pronged book already, because there are 5 authors almost. You could count, I think, 5 authors in that book, none of which are Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is never present in that book. You start off with a person called Victor Eremita, the victorious hermit, who finds these papers and creates this kind of, idea, this novel, that he finds these papers from 2 different figures, and one then goes into the person called A, the aesthetic person, who then transforms into Johannes the Seducer. And these are stepping stones for stages on life's way, as Kierkegaard will say in the following book, that how to become a human being. And very much you can be drawn into the aesthetic world very easily. Kierkegaard writes brilliantly, a bit like his counterpart in literature, Dostoevsky, who's much better often at writing the demonic figures that we're drawn to and not the holier figures. And with Either Or, most of his readership was drawn to the aesthetic side of Either Or. But that's up to you as the individual, to what you want to approach it to. And the second part then, of course, is Judge William, who's defending the marriage. And this is an extraordinary exposition on, it's a Hegelian Sittlichkeit defense of marriage and how we can create it. But it's also very existential. He breathes in, because of course there's lots of existentialism in Hegel himself, that this idea that we can forge our own history, and by being married to someone else, to committing to somebody, to turning that possibility into a task, one can forge a more authentic existence. But of course, at the very end of Either Or, there's an unnamed preacher who writes, "We are all wrong in the face of God," who kind of almost dissuades or takes away the whole argument of Judge William. And this goes on. Each book is almost like other ways of approaching the world through different masks. And I think that's really crucial. And I see that with Nietzsche as well, except Nietzsche is using the name Friedrich Nietzsche, and that he's almost working with himself. Kierkegaard uses the kind of theatrical, or he calls himself a dramatic philosopher at some point, that dramatic thinker, that he's using these dramatic strategies in order for one to be transformed. And even halfway through Either Or, in the second half of Either Or, the judge actually says, "If you have understood me, throw away the book. It's time to stop." This idea of activity going out there. But of course, Kierkegaard can never stop himself. He's writing until the very end, always using these different forms of existence. That's why I said he sees himself as a reader rather than the author of his books. Hope that answers your question. But there's a feast here on the idea of the mask in philosophy there, using it very, very, and I said his two main prototypes are Socrates and Christ, and he's quite original in how he rewrites them and transforms them into those things of mask, indirect communication, and living and existing for the truth and dying for the truth.
Thank you.
Which, by the way, truth is living an authentic existence. That's for Kierkegaard.
We've got time for maybe one more quick question, and there
Can you hear me? All right. Hi, Bartholomew. Thank you for your presentation. In one of your first slides, you mentioned these three types of transformations. So you mentioned the becoming of self in Kierkegaard, becoming a non-self in Schopenhauer, and the movement of self-overcoming in Nietzsche. In your understanding, do these three types of transformations refer to the same movement? Are we talking about the same movement of transcendence, or if not, could you sketch the differences between, becoming a self, becoming a non-self, and the movement of self-overcoming in Nietzsche?
we've got a couple of minutes to answer that one. We need to move on.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, good question. And that's it. They are quite different from each other, the three of them. So this is especially with Schopenhauer. I mean, as I said, Schopenhauer, this becoming, and there's that chapter by Sharp and Uri in their book is great, because actually their subtitle is Philosophy as a Way Out of Life. And that's, in a way, Schopenhauer starts to use philosophy as escaping from life. And this is what, rather than, and Kierkegaard, you could say, if you want to be a kind of a devil's advocate or critic of Kierkegaard, he's becoming a self, but ultimately he's finding a way to God or to Christ. He's still a religious thinker. While with Nietzsche, his ways, in his own trying to find of self-overcoming, he creates his own concepts, as we know, amor fati, eternal recurrence, and will to power, and the overhuman. So he's finding another way to overcome this idea, and after metaphysics. And with Kierkegaard, deeply existential, using Socrates and Christ, but in his process of becoming, there's still a deeply ethical element in Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard would say that Schopenhauer's ethics is too weak. He ultimately sides away from an existential ethics, while for Kierkegaard, ultimately the task is to love the other. He spends a lot of time, I didn't talk about that, but this idea of love, the philosophy of love, one must love one neighbor, in becoming oneself, you're becoming with others as well. So that's a very important element. So they do have three very different pathways they go on. What binds them all is very much this injection of looking at real life activity and an individual transformation, and their attack on making things too sedate, and their courage, their willingness to bring out voices, very passionate voices in their writings. And that's why people like to read Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, because of their style. And it's always pleasant, almost. It's a joy to read them as writers, and they engage you and they trigger you and provoke you. So that's where they're brought together, but they do go in different directions and very different ideas of ethics.
Thank you so much, Bartholomew.